The B.S. Gilmore story, episode 26, and the 1872 World Peace Jubilee, part 2. So, continuing on with this huge story, the World Peace Jubilee, where did the story start for Gilmore himself? Why did he come up with the idea? Was it unconsciously in 1869 and the development of the National Peace Jubilee? We don't know. Was it during the preparation of that Jubilee and maybe a knowledge that the standard of the musicians weren't actually as good as he had seen on his own trips to Europe itself? Or was it when Gilmore realized that if one selects the best bands in America at the time, which were simply the Germania Band, the Dodsworth Band of New York, and his own Gilmores Band, and then from those bands deselects all of the European musicians within the three organizations, I suppose Gilmore would have realized that there wasn't too much homegrown talent left within. But anyway, we don't know where that first indication came from. But we do know that on page 655, in his history of the National Peace Jubilee, there is a letter he wrote to a Mr. Ballou, who was a member of the committee in the National Peace Jubilee. And in that, he noted a full year and a half before the proposed new project to openly spread the idea of peace and goodwill to all men across the world. 3 pages later, he mentioned that it would be proposed to hold the event in the city of Boston in the month of June 1872. A World Peace Jubilee, he said, an international musical festival, and a union of all nations in harmony. Peace on earth, goodwill towards all men. So before I continue, don't forget to click like and subscribe, which will help the channel and indeed notify you about the next documentary published. This story is, as you can imagine, huge, but what I can tell you with the time constraints is but a mere taste of the detail that has now become evident with research into the World Peace Jubilee preparation. I'll try to give you as much as I can, but my apologies for having to cut the story short for obvious reasons. So by that statement in 1871 in the book, that there would be a World Peace Jubilee and a musical festival and a union of all nations, Gilmore provided us with some clues of his intentions and indeed his quest. He was going to find out what America needed to do to bring itself up to a standard at least equivalent to that of Europe. Again, I repeat that, to bring America up to a standard that was at least the equivalence of Europe. That has never been emphasized before. And so the wheels of inspiration were in motion in Gilmore's mind. Now, how would he bring all the ingredients he needed for this event and put them into a cooking pot called the Colosseum? In the history, he also stated that the first day would be dedicated to the motherland of America, but also Germany, England, Scotland, Ireland, France, Russia, Austria, and Italy, with all of them having their dedicated days, especially at the festival. How ambitious was this man? Gilmore outlined that the music of Austria, Prussia, Russia, France, and England would appear and be played in the new Coliseum that would now seat 100,000 audience. And so, not being shy, he decided to approach the ministers of all foreign governments in America, or in, I suppose, today's language, the ambassadors of all foreign governments, residing in America, chiefly in New York and Washington, to get their government support to release their bands for the festival. Sadly, they all thought that he was simply mad, with a mad idea, a mad project. The idea that music could bring people together in harmony? What a mad idea. Remember that the bands of England, as well as the bands of France, Prussia, Russia, and Belgium, were also the armies of those countries. They fought beside regular forces and were trained as army men. And so for them to play in Boston, they would have to be given special permission by their respective governments through their respective parliaments. And no small project to prepare even before a note was played. But now Gilmore had assessed the criteria, and personally he was well up to the challenge. He knew what he must do. And so he decided he needed introductions to individual governments now, and even individual ministers. And he got them from his mayor of Boston, from his government, and his president, and his friend Ulysses S. Grant. And a year later, written in August of 1871 by the mayor of Boston, that letter reflected how highly he and the city of Boston held Gilmore as a person and committed their complete support to him and his planned project. By September of 1871, Gilmore was already in Europe, and reports initially came from London that he had made a presentation to the Secretary for War, Mr. Edward Cardwell, detailing the plans for the Jubilee in detail. Mr. Cardwell had in turn promised his due consideration of the project and would in time offer his decision after consulting the government. Finally, Mr. Cardwell had suggested that if the answer was positive, he would offer the band of the Guards as the elite musicians to represent and play for the country. As with all subjects related to Gilmore, there has been quite a bit of waffle, as they say, and fiction told about Gilmore over the decades by various groups and individuals. One of which was that Gilmore had threatened to stop the Jubilee if there wasn't an Irish band. This is totally false, and its explanation will become clear at the end of the documentary. Afterwards, P.S. Gilmore went immediately to complete appointments already arranged on the continent of Europe with the governments of Belgium, France, Austria, and indeed the Kaiser in Prussia, and to persuade all nations to participate in the World Peace Jubilee of Nations. The wheels were now truly spinning. However, a tale surfaced later that a minister in Austria wrote to the Secretary of State in Washington, Hamilton Fish was his name, to inquire as to how this Gilmore chap had suddenly appeared in his offices in Vienna with a letter of introduction from President Grant. The minister, confused, had no idea who was Gilmore. and wished to check out this man's credibility. But likewise, the Secretary of State Fish, he was equally confused and wondered how Gilmore had got a letter from President Grant. In fact, he personally had refused a letter of introduction to Gilmore when the latter had put his case to him at his offices in Washington. I was very lucky in finding that in July 1871, Gilmore was in Washington indeed and met Mr. Fish. The report went on as follows in the New York Times, July the 9th, and it reported that Mr. Gilmore is here today in Washington, D.C. before the gentleman versed in foreign affairs with his program for an international musical festival convention to be held next year, probably in Boston. Sadly, there's very little else in the little article, but more of this at the end. Other details remain which I can't mention presently, like Gilmore camped out in wait for a famous fiddle player called Johann Strauss in Vienna, or indeed about Gilmore's visit to the Kaiser, actually successive visits to the Kaiser, and indeed his admiration of what the Irishman had achieved in America and how he expressed it. Sorry about that. Time doesn't allow. Now, remember the Irish band? Well, when he was with Cardwell, he asked for a band to represent Ireland from the British government, but he was refused on the basis that the band they would send would represent England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. So, to get around this, Gilmore, on his way back to America from Europe, called into Dublin, Ireland, where he had many contacts and friends in music for years, including the wonderful first professor of music in Trinity College, Dublin, Sir Robert Prescott Stewart, who instantly took on board the project to collect a band to represent the province of Ireland, as it technically was then, but the country of Ireland in Gilmore's and Irish minds at that time. Gilmore, therefore, would have his Irish band, in spite of Mr. Cardwell, or the English. Oh, and back to Mr. Fish and the President Grant letter. Sometime later, this request by Mr. Fish about information from a Viennese minister was raised and reported in President Grant's papers of record. And according to the story which we can imagine, President Grant, who knew Gilmore well, is reported in those papers of record in having broken out in laughter as he heard Fish recant the story. Now, can you imagine? Gilmore is ejected from Fish's office, and he may have, walked round to the back of the presidential suite of the Oval Office and climbed up to a window and gained access to talk to his war colleague hero and his friend, the President Ulysses S. Grant. So, ladies and gentlemen, more next week from Gilmore, the World Peace Jubilee, and this wonderful story. I hope you've enjoyed it. If so, click like and subscribe. Ask me whatever question you wish. There'll be a lot more. Thank you and regards from Ireland. Bye.